Hello everyone, welcome back. So where we've gotten to so far, so this is the usual stream for writing a programming language in Rust. We're working on Ash, an alternative for Bash programming, not necessarily the Bash shell. And in the last stream we had just finished off adding the syntax sugar for the chain operator, and we modified our existing arrow operator to be for type properties. Today we're going to be taking a look at catching errors as errors. So at the moment we have catching errors as booleans or sentinel values, as I suppose they could be called as well. And that's this syntax. So we have one question mark, and that will allow us to catch any type of error and just coerce it into a boolean for when we're not really too interested in what the exact error was. We just want to know if there was an error or not. By default, most issues in this language will raise an exception, as is the case with a lot of particularly scripting languages. But compared to Bash in particular, which tends to keep executing even if a command fails, we'll have a default behavior where the failure of a command will cause the program to abort. However, we have a lightweight operation to allow us to continue in that kind of a situation. But if we want some extra detail on how to handle a particular function, then or how to handle a particular error, we're going to use this kind of an operator, which will give us the full exception. So let's take a look at how we might implement that. So exceptions are basically going to be consisting of two things. First of all, we're going to allow throwing exceptions, and the exceptions in general are just going to be made up of two parts. They're just going to be plain objects with a name. That's going to be it's going to have a code. That's going to be the important part. And we're going to have different levels of syntax sugar for that. And primarily this syntax, ABC, is going to create a new object with this name. Or rather with that code. So let's go ahead and take a look at implementing that. So we already have the colon token that we use in other productions, but we're going to use that as a new type of production here. Is it going to be loosely binding? No, it's going to be fairly tightly binding. In fact, it's really just going to be only possible to follow it with one type of item with a regular identifier. So we're going to add here the identifier that must follow the colon, and so it's going to follow the usual rules for naming. And so we're probably going to, because this is really just again a syntactic sugar for declaring an object literal with a code property, we can probably go ahead and implement that. Do I have any macros for object literals? I think I might. Or no, if I remember correctly, actually. trying to remember how I define map literals. So we can do it this way. We can have a vector so we'll create a what are props? Are they a vector of items or are they an actual map? That could be interesting actually if the language actually allows duplicates in the object literal. Maybe it's caught at runtime, I'm not sure, but we'll take a look at that. Yeah, an object is a vector of prop items. Do we allow duplicates in that? It might make sense to actually catch any issues with duplicates at this point. That could be something useful to implement. And then the prop items go inside that. And the name in this case will be a string. It will be a raw expression string S it'll have no interpolation. The string itself will be the code that we just retrieved, and that'll actually be the value. The name will be code. I guess we define that as a string. Yeah, because that's what gets returned from string literals as well. And so I think we have the initial, okay. That's not so good. Because a lot of functionality is going to be based on, well, not a lot of functionality, but that was the syntax that I had in mind when designing this. So let's do like we did before, so that we can see the visualization of these parser conflicts. So I guess I can even imagine that there are a lot of issues with this. So if we have a colon followed by an identifier followed by an opening bracket, then it could say that the opening bracket is being applied as a dereference on the identifier, or the identifier is paired with the colon, and then that is a standalone expression as well. So we're kind of getting messed up from this in a way. There are probably a couple of ways we can address this. One is to say that this has to be an expression, and then we make sure that the expression is just an identifier on its own, but that's a little painful. Another one is to add delimiters to it, use a separate symbol. Well, I wonder, can I make it so that this is a separate production and this is really tightly binding, so that if we do encounter semicolon with an identifier, then it's always going to create the object that I'm describing here. And we're probably going to run up against some issues when we try to make it more complex as well, in terms of adding this stuff, the extra parameters. Whoops. Because again, this in theory will be a standalone syntax. You can do it in the context of a throw, but it doesn't have to be. Unless we make it so that it has to be in the context of a throw, but a throw can throw a named item, or it can throw, for example, if we have e equals some error, or if we have, for example, v error equals whatever, we then want to be able to just throw error, or we want to be able to wrap it. So my preference would be to be able to handle this especially. And actually, it's not enough to just treat this as syntax sugar, because this will have some additional logic around populating the function property of the object. Which I guess will evaluate to this. No, this is only when the value of this is only populated when a function is called as a property, or essentially as a method of an object. So that's not going to work there. We're going to have some additional logic around that. But we won't even be able to get to that point until we make it past this initial hurdle. So how do we handle this? So we have some loosely binding things at the top here, but we don't really want loose binding here. We want tight binding. We just want it to say if this is happening, then it overrides whatever is happening above it. So we might even make another precedence level even. We don't really have support for another precedence level at the moment. Can we do this? We'll try. Yeah, that is a bit of a problem. That if we have a range expression like this, then it could conflict with the identifier approach that we have there. Can I put it higher up the precedence chain? I don't really want to, but maybe that could get us out of this. No. we end up with the same situation. Is there a way we can specify that it shouldn't be used in that context? I don't think so. And I don't think we'd want to limit it in that way. Not that it would be of any use to be able to make those kind of constructions, but just that it'd be a bit hacky to work around it in that way, I feel. It seems like using the colon might be part of the problem here. So some other symbols that we could use are the at symbol and the modulo symbol. If I didn't allow these if I changed the symbol being used for ranges, I wonder would that resolve? It would. So, and I guess it still is an issue if we were to put it there. Is it? Maybe not. So it's really just owing to the range index. However, those symbols are fairly standard. Can I definitely not put it up earlier in the call chain? Yeah, I definitely can't. Because that gets followed by an expression. So what could it look like? Fn at my error. So you're not really, and you shouldn't specify the function when you're throwing the error. That would be a linting error. You're really just specifying the function when you're querying the error. Another symbol is the ampersand. But again, I feel like the association with that would be a bit obstructive in this scenario. Another option is backslash. Another option is, I think I mentioned it, just the fact that we can use a different symbol instead of this for the range, but I think the fact that it's in a couple of other languages already, particularly Python and Go, which are pretty common, means that there's a certain amount of inertia around it. Pipe operator, and we can have function my error. Not a big fan. So far, my vote is for the ampersand and at symbol. There's also tilde, but that can be a bit awkward to get at on some keyboards. Although it's a relatively common symbol at the same time. Used in a lot of C programming in particular. There could be comma. Another option could be to prefix it when the function is missing, so that we have it like hyphen colon my error and then fn my error when it's populated. Or we could say at to specify the current function. Or a double colon. for when you're throwing it. So far, hyphen is looking the best to me. And I assume that or maybe double colon, would it be a bit easier to type? I guess we'll go with hyphen at the moment just to try and unblock ourselves. And while that's building, I'll take a bit of a look at Lollipop documentation. And what I'm curious about is how we, in fact, maybe if I go back to the code, I might have some examples on it, on how to handle essentially when we want to match either this simple symbol or another identifier symbol. Okay, so in general, we just have different conditionals. So we'll try that and that. No, not a runner. And that makes sense still. Maybe we do use a dedicated symbol and we do kind of sort out the two issues in one. think that's basically it. So oh yeah, that's just in main again. So we want to create a new AST item to construct an error object. And that's going to have a few things going on. So we'll be able to, let's comment that out for now. We'll just focus on what it's going to look like. So we're going to have an optional function. Now, whether this can be just an identifier or can it be an expression? I think to make things simpler, we just make it an expression. Or sorry, we just make it an identifier. Well, we can't just make it an identifier because we might need to dereference it. So actually we do need to have it be an expression. Can we do it like that? Expression precedence 1. Yeah, I didn't think so. If I just have expression there, it's going to be the same thing. Yeah, because we only have one token of look ahead and yeah. Well, I really wasn't expecting as much trouble at this phase of implementing this feature. So let's go back and take a look at the syntax here. Unless we swap that around. No. But what's the issue in that case? Because when we do that, it's actually fine. that an expression 1, we have an issue. So let's see what the problem is. So if we have an expression like identifier at that, then it could be a function call on this as an expression, or it could be that. And we're going to run into the same issue when it comes to function calls as well, because the syntax is going to be something like this. So actually the syntax at the moment is more like throw my error at and whatever is on the right hand side here gets evaluated to a function. So let's consider some alternatives as well. So we have my error followed by an optional single argument function, followed by any number of nested errors, followed by fields. And that kind of looks a bit better as well in terms of delimiting the function in these brackets, because in general there won't be dereferences, but there could be. It's a bit messy. And there's a lot going on. I think this much makes sense. And when you're throwing, you're not going to specify this part. That's why I think it makes sense at the start, because you can just omit it. Would inner be called sources? I think this is going to take a bit of offline thinking to resolve, because there's a bit going on here. Yeah, I think I'm going to be playing with these different approaches offline, because it's, there isn't necessarily a specific problem to be solved here. It's more just playing around in the problem space and figuring out design wise what looks nicest, what makes the most sense, and then trying to retrofit that in a way that doesn't conflict with the existing productions in the language. So with that, I think I'm going to take that offline and play around with it. Well, at the same time, what I could do is just implement something that's functional for now and use that to unblock myself, and then just kind of figure out the syntax details later and possibly offline and what have you. So let's see. I'll just clear that for now. And just define it like that for the moment. So I'm hoping, that needs to be removed anyway. So So I'm hoping that that succeeds. No, what's the issue there? Did I save it properly? We'll give it one more go. That should really be up there. Yeah, so it's actually fine for the moment. So we're setting it up like this, and actually it's just going to be one argument, one expression there. Can I do it like that? And then we allow an object at the end. We'll see if that throws up any issues as well. Hopefully not. We'll see. Oops. Now, how do I make a section conditional? There are a couple ways. I can either split up the production into different sections, or I can do it like this. So that will be context, which is optional. And the inside of that needs to be in parentheses. Now, why is that not allowed? Because it could be followed by a block. Okay, in a while statement. Interesting. Wow. Very tricky. That's interesting. And so, just out of curiosity, I wonder what will happen if I make this section optional. So that can't have a name as well. Because it could be followed by it could think that it's a function. That a function call is happening afterwards. So in a way I need to kind of delimit the whole production if I want to treat it as an error. And so maybe I take a different approach. And I say that, for example, throw at that. Yeah, it's something I need to have a play around with, really, because the things that will be going into these errors are, well, when it's being thrown, it'll take the sources and the context, and then when it's being caught, it's going to take the function. Like, the important things are really just going to be the function. So maybe I've been trying to be a bit too general with the mechanisms that I have here. And maybe it's time to kind of take it back a little bit. So I think I'm going to, like I say, take that offline for a bit, play around with the different approaches, stay aware of the fact that a lot of these can result in ambiguities in the grammar, and hopefully when I come back I'll have some fresh ideas on how we integrate this into the language, because in theory it shouldn't be so difficult to implement, but yeah, the syntax is definitely turning into a definite hurdle. So yeah, with that, I'm going to leave it there. That kind of brings us to a relatively tidy hour-long session. So I'm going to leave that for now and yeah, call it a day. Thanks very much for tuning in, and see you again.